All right, welcome to our CASA training on kinship navigation. I'm so excited to be joined today by Karelynn Thompson, and she is the Executive Director of Children's Choice. Karelynn, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to introduce yourself just a little bit to us?
Absolutely. Thank you, Lauren, for having me. I am the State Director for Children's Choice here in Delaware, and Children's Choice provides a number of programs throughout the state, including foster care, kinship, family intervention, permanency services, lots of stuff going on at Children's Choice. But we recently started the Kinship Navigation Program, and this is really just an opportunity to share with you a little bit more about what that program looks like and how it works and how families and kids are connected to the Kinship Navigation Program. So, Lauren, is it okay if I just jump right in?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, absolutely. All right. So throughout the discussion today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what does kinship care look like in the state of Delaware? What does that data look like? I'm going to introduce to you the kinship navigation practice model that we're using here in Delaware, which is called KinTech. And then I'm also going to talk about what are the next steps for the KinTech model here in Delaware. So to start off, we want to start off with a definition of what kinship care is. And so Delaware has adopted a broad definition similar to the one here at CWLA that talks about kinship caregivers being not just blood relatives, but they are also full-time caregivers that are providing nurturing and protection of children. They might be relatives, members of their tribe or clan, godparents, step-parents, aunts, uncles, older siblings, and it even includes other people like a former teacher or a coach or a dance instructor. So really kinship is really more about that bond that caregiver has with the child prior to them entering care. And if they had a good relationship with the child prior to that child entering foster care or being involved with the child welfare system, they can be considered a kinship caregiver. So talking a little bit about why kinship care is needed. And kinship care should really be seen sort of as like a parallel track with foster care and why foster care is needed. So the same reasons why kids would go into foster care are the same reasons why kids need to be in kinship care. And it includes the things that you see here, like parental substance abuse. That's a huge one in Delaware. Mental health issues is another big one in Delaware. Domestic violence, maybe a child's parent is deceased, parents are incarcerated, there's child abuse and neglect, or it could be a teenager that is not ready to be a parent and doesn't have supports in place to care for that child. There are 3 different types of kinship arrangements, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of each one. Let's see, the first one here is informal. This is where families make arrangements outside of DFS and outside of the court system. So an example of this might be, let's take that teenager, for example. A teenager gets pregnant, they're living with maybe with their mom and maybe mom's boyfriend, and there's a younger sibling in the home. Teenager gets pregnant and the family really just can't take on that financial burden of having another child in the home, and that teenager may not be ready to parent that baby themselves. So the parent of the teen and the teen may say, okay, it's really in the best interest for grandma to get involved. And so maybe the teen and the baby go live with grandma, or maybe just the baby goes and lives with grandma. That would be an example of an informal arrangement that's made by family. What we do see is that both informal and voluntary arrangements ultimately sort of end up on the formal side of things, because eventually court does kind of get involved. But the big piece here is with informal arrangements, DFS is not involved. So that happens outside of child welfare. The second situation is voluntary. And with that, it means that there is some system involvement, but DFS does not usually have custody of the child. So This is a situation where it's been determined that the children are no longer safe in the home with the parents, and so they need to be removed from their family situation. But then maybe an aunt steps up and says, "Well, I will take the kids, and they can come live with me until mom gets herself together and gets the services and things in place, and then the kids can go back and live with her." So that would be an example of a voluntary arrangement. So DFS is involved. They make a safety plan. They kind of help facilitate that conversation, but they don't actually take custody of the child. And then the last one is formal. And this is where DFS is involved. They typically take custody of the child, and then the placement with the relative is also formalized through a court order. So it would be like putting the child in foster care, but with a relative. All right, so what is the prevalence of kinship care, not just here in Delaware, but if we look at it nationally, there are about 8 million children who are living with a relative that is the head of their household. There's about 2.5 million children who are being raised by a relative that do not have any biological parents in their household at all. And then we have about 2.5 million who are grandparents raising their grandchildren. And kinship care is the fastest growing type of out-of-home placement nationwide. And a lot of that is because there is some federal push legislation and push to focus on kids that are involved with child welfare being placed with their family before they're placed in the foster care system. There are some challenges with those numbers, though, because they're really just estimates for the reasons that you see here. So first of all, a lot of kinship caregivers, they actually don't provide care full time all of the time. Sometimes that care is intermittent. So it might only be for, say, 3 or 4 months at a time, but it might happen, 3 or 4 months every year. Or maybe, a child is with them for 3 or 4 months and then they go home and then they come back to them, 6 months later. So intermittent care makes that really hard to track. The other piece is that kinship caregivers often feel really guilty, particularly when it's grandparents who are raising grandchildren. There's a lot of shame and guilt that come with that situation, because it sort of lends itself to identifying that their child or their relative isn't capable of taking care of their own children. And so that tends to, they feel as if that reflects on them or their family. We also see caregivers who really face a lot of challenges with sharing their caregiver status because they're afraid there's going to be consequences. Like they might lose their job, they might lose their childcare. There's financial ramifications for it. So there's a lot of concerns from some caregivers about sharing that status with other people. So they tend to hide it. And so what we know is that the number of kids that are in kinship care is really underreported. And that's everywhere. That's here in Delaware, but that's also nationwide too. So what does it look like in Delaware? If you look at the numbers here, it shows that 85% of kinship caregivers in Delaware are grandparents. Wow. And in Delaware, there's about 16,000 grandparents who are living with their grandchildren. What's interesting about these numbers is that it doesn't capture all kinship caregivers. And the most recent data from like 2021 into early 2022 suggests that there's actually closer to 22,000 kinship caregivers throughout the state. Those extra 5,000 to 6,000 cases or kids, I guess, or caregivers actually include, siblings, aunts, uncles, teachers, coaches, like those, also those victim kin situations too.
Karelynn, in your time working with the Kinship navigation program, what kind of have you seen a dramatic increase in the amount of people willing to be kinship providers?
So I think that what we've seen is that DFS, now that there's a program in place that will support kinship caregivers, we are seeing an increase in the number of kinship placements that are happening. because DFS is identifying that there are supports. So maybe they were interacting with a kinship caregiver that previously they may not have decided would have been a good option because that caregiver had a lot of challenges, just a lot of barriers in terms of accessing services or getting financial support, those kinds of things. But our program goes in and works with that family to overcome those things, to make that kinship placement possible. And so what we have seen is that since we've started the implementation of this program, which was only a year ago, that we started working with families around the model, we have seen an uptick in the number of kinship placements that have happened. I wouldn't say dramatic increase, because I'll share some numbers at the end, a little more towards the end about what the goals are. But we are seeing a steady increase, which I think is really what we want to see.
Gotcha. I would imagine just by having the supports in place, people might be more willing and able to provide that kinship care, where maybe without those supports, they would not have otherwise been able to do so.
Yes, and that is absolutely true. And we are hoping that as families learn more about the program, that they will identify themselves as options as well as DFS, being able to say, you can do this because there's this program here. So I think that we're definitely thinking about the same things long term.
Gotcha.
All right, so just to give you a little bit more, little more data here, you can see some numbers here on the screen. If you look at this big circle here, that's all of those kids living with caregivers. So 22,562 children are living in homes where a relative is the head of household. Then if you look at the smaller circle, you've got 15,000 children being raised by a kinship caregiver with no parent present. Like I said, this number is probably a lot higher, just because this is based on those reported cases. And then if you look at the small circle, this is the number of kids roughly, and this number changes, of kiddos that are in the formal foster care system that are placed with kinship caregivers. So the 63, I will share with you, that 63 number is out of just over 500 total children in the Delaware foster care system. So it's really a very small percentage of kids in the foster care system that are actually placed with relatives versus being in formal foster care.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So this gives you a breakdown of what those foster care placements look like. So as you can see, the very top number here, 65% of kids are placed in non-relative family foster homes. So of the 500 or so kids, and this number is based off of 460 from 2018, that number is a little over 500 now. So about 65% of those kids are placed in non-relative foster family homes. At the time that this data was represented, there was 9% of placements were with a relative. The updated data, and this is kind of gradually increased over the past 2 years as we've rolled this program out, we're seeing it closer to 18-19% of kids are now placed with relatives, which is huge. That's a huge growth in just 2 years. And then you can see the other numbers, like, related to like a group home or an institution, pre-adoptive home, kids that are on runaway, that are in supervised independent living and trial reunifications. So when we first implemented this program, we did so because the federal government was making a real big push for families to stay together. And that's what we want. Those of us who are working in the child welfare realm, we want kids and families to be together. We know that the data shows that children and parents do better when they can stay connected, when they can be together as a unit. Mm-hmm. So there's been a big shift in federal legislation to really emphasize the importance of doing kinship placements. And Delaware, we've got a lot of great stuff going for us because we're a small state, but this is one of those areas where we were a little slow to catch on. And so the federal government reached out to us and said, hey, we have this money at the federal level. Delaware has not accessed it. We would like for you to put in a request to access this funds. And this was specifically to put together a kinship navigation program. So Delaware did. We submitted this request. and we were granted the funds. So then we had to go, then DFS needed to go through the process of spending that money. You know, what were they going to do with it? How are they going to facilitate a program, that sort of thing. And in 2020, they issued an RFP requesting agencies to, come up with a plan to develop a kinship navigation program. And that's how Children's Choice got involved. So we were the recipient of that RFP award. And then we began working with Division of Family Services in October of 2020. So one of the first things that we needed to do was to reach out to kinship caregivers in Delaware and really identify what those needs were, to really kind of figure out what model we needed to have in Delaware that would work best to support those caregivers. Mm-hmm. So when we reached out to caregivers and did a survey, these are those things that came up in that survey. These are the things that they really needed. And it was a lot of kind of simple things that turn into complex problems. Childcare is huge. Getting access to childcare was a big one. That financial support is another big one. Medical care, and that includes things like getting access to medical insurance, like Medicaid, and even access to private insurance if there's private insurance in place. Getting kids enrolled in school, accessing IEPs and services within the school, getting counseling for the kids, support for those caregivers, legal assistance. And then just they really felt like they didn't have a good knowledge base for what programs and services were out there that could support them. Mm-hmm. All right, so talking about why kinship care is preferable, and I touched on this just a minute ago. But the big thing is that when children are living with people that they already know and trust, it makes that removal from their birth family environment easier. It lessens those feelings of separation and loss. It also helps children keep their family identity. Kinship care really promotes and supports that family preservation. And then it also really helps to support the child's culture, the family's culture, their community's culture. And kinship really is based on strengths and not limitations of the family. All right, so just to kind of touch on what kinship navigator requirements are. So the program assists kinship caregivers in learning about and finding, and then ultimately utilizing programs and services to meet the needs of the children that are placed in those kinship homes, as well as the family, even those caregivers, their needs. The idea is to promote partnerships between public and private agencies, and to ensure that those kinship caregivers are getting the services that they need to keep those placements stable and those kids and their families in a safe environment. All right, so let's talk about KinTech. So KinTech is a kinship navigation model that was provided by the Children's Home Network. Children's Home Network is based out of Florida, and they're operating in about 10 counties in the state of Florida. So KinTech model has been developed over the past 20 years. It's been rigorously tested. It's nationally recognized as a leader in supporting kinship families. And they just recently were awarded evidence-based model through the California Clearinghouse, which is another huge milestone for this program. What that also means is that Delaware, because we're using the KinTech model, is utilizing an evidence-based model to provide kinship navigation services. So KinTech, when we were going through that process of figuring out what the model needed to look like here in Delaware, we did an evaluation of tons of models that are out there all over the country, and we settled on KinTech because of their experience, because of the data that shows how effective their program is. And so the KinTech staff through the Children's Home Network have been working with Children's Choice and DFS for the past 2 years to teach us this model and help us implement it here in Delaware. And it's really been great.
Yeah, how long has the KinTech model been around?
So it's been so they've been doing kinship care for about 20 years. And if I remember correctly, they started the model around 2012, formally started the model. And then they, of course, have just added to it and tweaked it over the last 10 or so years. And then to the point now where they've got it down, and it's now considered that evidence-based model, which I think is just awesome.
Yeah, because I remember chatting with you a little while ago about, searching to find a program that was evidence-based, but I thought it's sort of like the chicken or the egg argument. What comes first? You need a model to be evidence-based, but you need, evidence-based to provide a model. So
Yes.
it seems like they've figured it out, which is great. And they're able to help other states.
Yes, absolutely. And there were a few other states out there that had models that were kind of in that same run, if that makes sense, of trying to, put the model in place and then get the evidence to go behind it. And it's just very rigorous and it takes a very long time. Mm-hmm. But they had been doing research and evaluation studies on their services for a long time. So they were able to utilize all of that data from even before 2012, all those years that they were working on the model. They were able to utilize that to support the work that's ultimately become the Kinship model, which I think gave them a leg up. So it was really good to see, that kind of history that was there.
Awesome.
So talking about the model, this is just sort of an umbrella slide here. I'm going to go into each of these things a little bit more in a couple minutes. But Kinship includes coordinated intake, peer-to-peer navigation, benefits connection and help with enrollment, an interdisciplinary team, and a community collaborative, and then a focus really on prevention. So we're going to kind of talk about these things here in just a second. And this gives you a visual of like, what does a Kinship navigator do? So really, if you look at this like a wheel, and the Kinship navigator is sort of at the center of that wheel. And then what they do is with the caregiver. So the caregiver and the Kinship navigator are sort of in the center there. And that navigator reaches out and touches all of these elements that are out there in the community and in the system to form those connections for that caregiver. And it brings those services in to the caregiver rather than the caregiver having to go out to each individual one. It provides that linkage sort of all at the same time. And so some of those linkages include public assistance, legal, aging services in the state, education, healthcare, mental health, even substance abuse services when needed. And of course, partnering with child welfare as well. All right, so let's talk first about the community collaborative. So this is a really cool, this is a really interesting feature actually of the Kinship model. It is a multi-system, multi-sector partnership that really allows the Kinship navigation program to work within the community. And what it does is it brings people from different agencies, different aspects of the state to the table once a month to really talk about what the needs of Kinship caregivers are here in Delaware. And it allows us to form some of those really good connections where when we start to face a barrier within the system or within a system on behalf of the caregiver, we're able to kind of break down some of that red tape by having those relationships with those people who meet with us on a monthly basis. So it also gives us an opportunity to really educate our community partners, those people who are working alongside us with these families, about the needs of the families, the challenges that they face, the barriers that are there in the system, and really start to help break down those barriers so that families can access what they need to access. So this happens once a month, and we've been doing this collaborative now for just over a year. We started it, I think it was in July of 2021. So we just passed a year of meeting our collaborative members on a monthly basis. And it's really pretty cool to see the information sharing that happens during that call.
Awesome. And Karelynn, in that 15-ish month period of time since the collaborative started, have you noticed an increase in the amount of participants and different community partnerships that join?
Absolutely. So when we first started, we had a list of probably about 15 to 20 agencies and, people throughout the state, whether they were in the state system or whether they were in a private sector. And so we are now up to close to 70 participants. Now they don't participate every month. Not all of those people, come every month. We average somewhere around 15 to 20 per month that join the call, but you do see there is a little subset of people that do join every month, as you know, Lauren, because you're part of that committee too. But also, we also see that their agencies do come in and they kind of come in. If they don't come every month, they kind of filter through every other month, or they send different representatives for those agencies. But we're about roughly 70 participants now that are part of the collaborative. So that's really cool to see in just a year's time.
Yeah, definitely. I can't do the math in the number of growth, but that's pretty good. Because I ask because CASA volunteers so often ask if the CASA program has a list of community providers, like who offers mental health services, who offers adoption classes, who offers transportation, like things like that. And we've tried to kind of put things together, but we've also realized that as soon as we hit print, something changes. So I love looking at this collaborative model and just thinking it's kind of a living document, so to speak, but it's just sort of living group that just keeps changing, and it's super helpful. Delaware is really small, but at the same time we have a lot of different things happening. So I love the collaborative because it lets me get to know who's offering different services, and I've learned of all sorts of services that I didn't even know existed. So it's really, really great.
Well, and it kind of serves two purposes, right? Is that it supports the Kinship navigation program, but it also supports those agencies that are in attendance, because they're learning about each other. We're learning about the needs of those agencies. And the idea is that it is a mutual relationship. So not only are they supporting the Kinship program, but we and the other participants are supporting each other. And so like we do ask, during that discussion towards the end of our call, we always ask, is there anything new or updates about your program? Are you in need of referrals? Are you on hold? Do you have a wait list? And the idea is that if a program needs referrals, maybe they were on a wait list for a while, but now they've opened up a wait list. They've closed the wait list and they now have openings in their program, but they don't have those referrals coming in. This is a great way to let the community know, because a lot of these programs work together anyway. And so this is just another way to help support each other in the work that we're doing. And it's all different fields. So it's interesting for sure.
Yeah.
So from that collaboration, this is kind of what allows us to expand what we can offer, right? So on the left side here, these bullets that are to the left, these are the things that we provide as an agency in the Kinship navigation program. So we do that psychosocial historical assessment. We provide case management, a family support plan, navigation of services, advocacy for the caregivers, community outreach and education, and we provide support groups as well. On the right side are services that many families need access to, but we don't do as an agency. And so we're able to connect those caregivers to these services because of those relationships we've established with the collaborative. Things like substance abuse workshops or services, legal services, family conferencing, tutoring, mentoring, respite has been one, developmental screenings, childcare has been another big one, even health and wellness stuff really comes out of the collaboratives as well. So this gives you an idea of what caregivers are experiencing currently. So the numbers here on the screen are if a caregiver is eligible for TANF, and that's temporary assistance to needy families, that's a cash-based benefit that you get through Department of Health and Social Services. Only 12% of the eligible caregivers are receiving TANF.
Wow.
42% of eligible caregivers are receiving SNAP benefits, or what's commonly referred to as food stamps. 42% are receiving Medicaid, 17% receive childcare, and 15% have access to those housing services. So you can see here that there's a huge discrepancy between the number of eligible caregivers versus the number of caregivers that are actually receiving benefits. And one of the things that we're trying to do through this program is increase the access to these services that are already out there and providing supports to families. So one of the things that we did is we entered into an MOU with Department of Health and Social Services that allows our navigators to enroll clients directly for services through DHSS. So the caregivers do not have to go to, go online to fill out an application. They don't have to go to a state service center. They can actually work right with their navigator to fill out those applications and submit their documents. And that's helpful to a lot of our caregivers because many of them are older citizens, they're grandparents. Some of them are in that elderly category and struggle with that technology usage. Or they live in an area where they don't have reliable internet access. And so our navigators are able to help them work through that. Yeah. The next thing that really does make this model unique is that we have a peer navigator. And this is a person who has lived kinship caregiver experience, meaning they themselves are a kinship caregiver. They've walked in those shoes. They've had to navigate through those challenges, figure out the barriers and navigate around those. And so they understand on a very personal level what our caregivers are going through. This allows them to really navigate those systems that caregivers often interface with in a completely different way. And the caregivers are more receptive to receiving help from a person who can say, I've done this. I know how hard this is. And they're more likely to work to overcome those barriers when they have a peer in place. So this piece is huge as far as, success of the program and getting our families to really engage. Having our peer navigator has really been invaluable. The next thing that happens is what's called an interdisciplinary team. So when we have a caregiver who presents to us with really complicated challenges, maybe they have multiple system involvement, there might be barriers in each of those systems, we go back to our collaborative and we identify those representatives from those agencies that are part of the systems that the caregiver either is involved with or should be connected to. Mm-hmm. And we pull them together at one time and help create a plan to address the needs of the caregiver. What's really nice about an interdisciplinary team is that the caregiver only has to make one meeting. They have to show up one time and they receive the help and benefit from, say, 4 or 5 different organizations all at the same time. And so it's like a one-stop shop.
Yeah, gosh,
which is huge.
It's so easy. Yeah, it's so great to just kind of have such a comprehensive group together.
Yes. We did one just a few weeks ago, actually, for a grandfather who's been raising his grandchildren now for a number of years, but has really been struggling. And it was really cool to see there's 4 or 5 different people who joined the discussion. We did it through Zoom. And so they joined the discussion and we literally tackled every single barrier that this grandfather had. We were able to make a plan for each item on his list of concerns. And each person on that collaborative call, on the IDT call, was able to walk away with an action step that they needed to go do to make sure that this grandfather got what he needed to get as far as services goes. And so it really was cool to see, how one meeting could have such a profound impact on a family.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Absolutely.
It's very cool. So I'm going to kind of just push through these real quick. So, we go through all of this process and talking about what the service looks like and all of that, but we want to know what's the goal, right? What is the expected outcomes of a family that is receiving these services? And so there's some really significant ones here. The first one is safety. We really want to make sure that kids and families are safe. We want to increase permanency options. We want to support those permanency plans, meaning kids don't remain in foster care unnecessarily. They don't remain in the state's custody, any longer than is absolutely necessary, and that they can be either reunified with their parents, or that they can achieve permanency, such as adoption, guardianship, permanent guardianship with their relatives. Another big one is their well-being. And this is not just children, but it's also caregiver well-being. So when we focus on the whole family, everybody does better. The other outcome is just increasing access to programs and referrals to those programs. And then, at the end of all of this, the caregiver feels satisfied overall with the services that they've received, not just with the navigation program, but with the other services that are now being provided to them. The other thing is the kinship navigation practice, the KinTech model here in Delaware, is helping the Division of Family Services meet some of the goals that we have as a state. The first one here, and I touched on these a little bit just a second ago, but the first thing being safety. So we really want to decrease those instances of abuse and neglect. We want to increase the support for kinship caregivers, which ultimately reduces those abuse and neglect experiences for the kids. And then it also reduces the overall re-entry or entry into the formal foster care system. We also want to see kids safely maintained in their own homes or with their kinship caregivers when possible. And improving the well-being of caregivers, we're also seeing that there's improved well-being for children as well. So taking care of the parents or the caregivers is taking care of the kids.
Yeah, sure.
Permanency. So we're seeing stability in living situations. We see that kids tend to stay stable in one placement when they're with relatives over what it would look like if they were placed in a non-relative foster family home. We see there's a lot more movement around in placements when the kids are in formal foster care than they are when they're with kinship caregivers. And then, of course, relationships with their family are preserved. And then the well-being piece. So we increase the family's capacity to care for kids' needs. Lauren, that's what you're talking about sort of at the beginning, right? Was like caregivers being able to say, I can do this, because they have the supports now in place to do that. We're seeing kids that are receiving appropriate services to meet their educational needs, to meet their mental health and their physical health needs. And then also looking at strengthening that family search and engagement that's happening at other phases throughout the process of a child being involved with the child welfare system, and looking at sort of moving those services into the front end of service delivery to increase those engagements. So here's a little bit more data, lots of numbers today. But this just shows you what the KinTech model outcomes have looked like. So I talked about research, I talked about evidence. This is the evidence that I'm talking about. The KinTech model in Florida was evaluated at 12, 24, and 36 month studies. And what they saw was a greater than 90% success rate. So they saw kinship placements, kinship placements went to 60% kin placements and 70+% in some counties with kin. Now keep in mind, Delaware, when we first started this journey, was at 9%, right? So our goal, right. So our goal here, right, is to get to that. Our goal, actually the federal requirement or the federal goal is 65%. So the federal government wants to see in the child welfare system nationwide, 65% of kids are placed with kinship caregivers. So, here you go. This KinTech model, where it's operating in the state of Florida in those counties, is showing already 60%, and in some cases 70%. They're also showing 99% no re-entry into care with no new abuse or neglect reports, and an increase in caregiver and child well-being. That is huge. I mean, wherever do you see 99% anything in the child welfare system as an outcome, right? Like that just doesn't happen. So to see this is huge, that 99% of kids and families that are involved with this model don't see any type of re-entry into formal foster care and there's no new abuse or neglect reports. And that's just amazing.
Yeah, I think that
So,
the statistics just absolutely speak for themselves about why kinship care is so necessary, but and positive.
yes, agreed. And it shows that this model, over the 20 years of development that it's been in, has really figured out the right combination of tools and services to provide to families to make those numbers possible.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so this also shows us a little bit of data from the Children's Bureau, and this is about the Kinship model. And so the Children's Bureau recognizes that caregivers are least likely to be substantiated for abuse or neglect. They're seeing increased TANF enrollments, increased quality in services around those emotional supports and mental health, greater helpfulness from programs, increased social supports, and then improved child and family well-being and resiliency. So this is data right from the Children's Bureau about the Kinship model. All right, so I talked a little bit about federal legislation, and the federal legislation federal legislation that I'm talking about is the Family Prevention Services Act. And this is a specific piece of legislation that really focuses on prevention services for families to keep families intact. And then it focuses on when families can't remain intact, really promoting those kinship caregiver situations. So what it does is it provides money to help support those services. So an evidence-based kinship navigation model allows the state of Delaware to pull in some of that funding to be able to better provide those services and impact more kids and more families. So what do you do if you're working with a family or a child where kinship care is being discussed? And maybe, it's like, well, this kinship caregiver could really be a good option, but they don't have the right supports in place, or, things like that. So these are the contacts for Pam, who is she's our kinship program coordinator. She's a supervisor for the kinship navigation program. And for myself, so that we can, if you have a situation that comes up where you're not really sure what can be done, or what kind of services the family might be able to access, that kind of thing. Those are situations where you can call us and we can kind of talk through and figure out, is it a good idea to send a referral to us, or is it something that we can connect you with other resources, for example. So we receive referrals right now through the DFS workers, and we also allow referrals to come over from OCA. So through CASA, through the guardian ad litems, and through the court system. We actually we have a couple of judges that send referrals as well. So this is how you would reach out to us if you have a question or you're interested in sending a referral. We would provide you with a referral form. Lauren also has those, the most recent version of that, and can share that also with CASAs or other individuals who might need it as well. But I always say, if you have a question or you're not sure, please reach out. We're happy to talk through whatever situations we can.
And that's awesome, Karelynn. Thank you so much, because a lot of times CASA volunteers, at least, especially in the beginning of a case, will work with the family and DFS to try to identify potential family members, even if they're not able to take legal guardianship or anything yet. Is it possible that they would consider becoming a kinship care provider? So it's helpful to kind of give a CASA a direction of, okay, so if you've identified a family that's willing and interested, or at least wants some more information, they can contact you directly and say, here's what I've got, how do we kind of make this happen?
Yes, absolutely. And if there's a question about a service that maybe you've identified that family is going to need in order to do this successfully, we might be able to help you figure out what that is, or help you connect with that service provider to make sure that that sort of thing is lined up before you even go down the road of exploring that caregiver, or really finalizing that, that arrangement, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of, I just know from our experience, like a lot of families that are willing and interested to provide kinship care just get lost in the overwhelmingness of all the different acronyms and providers and services. So having you all there to kind of guide and say, all right, here's what's available, and here's who we talk to for each of those services. So that's awesome.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's thinking back to a saying that I've been saying with Lauren now a number of times, right? So the goal of our program is not just to teach our families how to fish, right? Because it's like the idea is like you teach a person to fish, you can feed them for their entire lifetime. So our goal is not just to teach them how to fish, but our goal is to teach them where to fish. Because if you know how to fish, but you don't know where to go to get the fish, right? You're not going to be very successful. You're still going to be hungry. So our job is to walk alongside the caregivers to teach them where the lakes are, the best parts of the lake to go fishing, all of that stuff. So our goal is to really teach them so that when we walk away from their family, in a formal sense, we have our support group and we're always available to families even after they discharge from us. But as we walk away from them in a formal sense, like they've successfully completed our program, they're going to know how to go back and access those things down the road if they run into situations again where they need services.
Yeah, I love that. And just absolutely, they've got the sustainability and the ability to continue their own services once they're connected. It makes so much sense. And I love just watching this program grow because it is so helpful on so many different levels. And knowing that, currently the state foster care system is taxed to the max. They're operating at roughly a third less capacity than they normally have. So it's that many less places for kids to go for, safe places to live. So utilizing kinship care is, good for this, just that balance as well.
Absolutely. Yep. I agree. 100%.
I love it. Awesome, Karelynn. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this with me today. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Anytime. And just reach out if there's any questions.
Will do. Thanks.